It's a lot to dig into and a lot to chew on. Let's start with the Buffalo Bills. For each of these teams, if you guys haven't listened to the other previews, we're recapping their offseason in 60 seconds. The Bills promoted Bobby Babich to be their DC, signed Deion Dawkins to an extension, Teron Johnson, Dawson Knox, and both Taylor Rapp and David Edwards on smaller deals. Brought in Curtis Samuel in free agency, 3 years, $24 million. Retained Daquan Jones, also retained AJ Epinesa, which we'll get to. Traded Stephon Diggs to the Texans, traded Ryan Bates to the Bears. Obviously, that's the real highlight one. Lost Gabe Davis, Leonard Floyd, Dane Jackson, Mitch Morse, Trey White, Jordan Poyer, and Tyrell Dotson. Some guys leaving in free agency, some guys because of cost cutting. Drafted Keon Coleman after trading down into the second round. Drafted safety Cole Bishop, also in the second round. And Dwayne Carter, defensive tackle, in the third round. For all of these teams, we've started this off with essentially a blue chip check-in. How many blue chip players are on this roster? One, because I think it's a good way to gauge a roster heading into the season. And two, because there are times where we'll get through these entire team previews and not talk about the best players because we kind of know what those guys are. So for the Bills, how many blue chip guys did you have for this team heading into the season?
I had two. One of them is incredibly obvious. It's the quarterback. It's Josh Allen, second best quarterback in the league. At least top three. So he's incredible. My other one was I'm there with Ed Oliver. I think Ed Oliver is incredible.
Interesting.
Here's the thing. There were only 3 interior defensive linemen with more pressures last year than Ed Oliver. It was Aaron Donald, Quinnen Williams, and Chris Jones. And then he was tied with Justin Madubuike and
You
Denzel
think those
Ware.
guys are blue chip players, those three guys?
Yeah. And so if he's right up in there with those guys, I think I'm gonna have to give it to him.
I'll let that happen. If we were going to give it to Christian Wilkins for the Raiders section, I think that we can give it to Ed Oliver as well. I'd throw Deion Dawkins in there for similar reasons, because when we've been doing left tackles, essentially if you clear a certain bar at left tackle, you become like a foundational piece for a team. And I think he's really settled into his own over the last couple of years as they've transitioned the way that they run the ball. I mean, he's one of the most powerful left tackles in the league. So if guys like Colton Miller and other people we've thrown out there apply to this, I would say that Deion Dawkins does as well. I'm fine with those three. I would say Teron Johnson's probably like one step down from there. He's like arguably the most important player on their defense at this point, considering some of the guys they've lost and some of the injuries that they've endured. And then I've thrown in like an ascending guy that I think is interesting, just worth mentioning, talking about roster construction. Greg Rousseau has flashes to me. Like there is a level to his play that I think could potentially exist somewhere down the line. He's a little bit younger. We'll talk about him a little bit more as we dig into the show. One of the counterbalances that we've done to kind of offset the blue chip players, essentially, what question marks does this team have? Because there have been some teams where they don't have many blue chip guys, but they also have no holes on their roster. So we've done this for each of the teams that we've discussed. What's significant? 5, 4, 3. What significant depth chart questions do you think the Buffalo Bills have heading into the year?
I think they've got 2 pretty big ones that we're probably going to agree on. One being the receiving core. I don't think it's necessarily bad. They're just banking on a lot of young players to step up. And
It is
when
certainly unknown at the
it's a
very least.
it's unknown, and I'm willing to give them kind of the leash that we gave Patrick Mahomes last year, where it's like, the quarterback is so good, maybe this can be okay.
Ooh, all right.
But but there is still a lot of unknown with the receivers themselves. And then the other one is obviously everything outside of the front four on defense. Well, not everything. I think the cornerback room, there's a lot to be excited about, but the safety room and the linebacker room, especially now without your best player and one of the best linebackers in the league, a lot of question marks there.
Yeah, the second and third levels of the defense, especially the spine of the defense, a lot of question marks. The corner room, I feel good about. They have 2 outside guys in Benford and Rasul Douglas. I think that Khair Elam is decent depth. He's had a really good camp, and if he's your third best corner, you're probably in a pretty good spot. And we talked about Teron Johnson, but the safeties and the linebackers, that was going to be a question coming into the year when they were healthy. Now, Bishop hadn't played much early in training camp, and you're going to miss Matt Milano for a good majority of the season. That has gone from a question mark to a big screaming red blinking light for me. So I think we have to mention both of those.
And what makes the Milano thing even more interesting in the spine of the defense, like kind of more important, is we've said this before. I think we said this on the defense show. When you lose your 2 kind of shot callers and veterans at safety, Matt Milano was supposed to be the glue that kind of held everything
We'll get
together
to
there.
this. We'll
Yeah.
get to this because this is one of the things that I'm very concerned about, but we're on the exact same page there. For each of these teams, as a way to dig into our biggest questions that we have about them, the way that we framed this is, what are you watching for the first month of the season when you're taking in the Buffalo Bills? So what is that for this team?
I'm gonna sound like a broken record because I've said some version of this about the Bills for probably 3 years now. It's just what are they going to get out of the run game, specifically now that David Edwards is playing guard and Connor McGovern is slotting into center for them, obviously. So shuffling some things around is going to change some stuff. But last year was kind of the first time they actually got good at the run game and stuck to it. Because there had been over the past few years some spurts, right, where they would have a month where it was like, man, they are really pounding people in the run game, and then he'd go away and or somebody would get hurt and it would just fall away. But last year felt like the first time they really found it and committed to it. I really just want to see if they can uphold that with some of the new changes they've made along the interior.
I also feel like they were able to run the ball in years past because they were getting really favorable boxes because of how the team was constructed. Last year, I felt different because they could run the ball on their terms. And the fact that they could do that and do it so efficiently, I think really did signify a shift in what this team felt like when you were watching them. From their end of things, they actually believe that McGovern is like kind of a natural center and it's probably his best position, which, again, that is something that sounds great in August. We'll see what actually happens when the games kick off. And Edwards, has gotten a decent amount of run in the NFL. He played a decent amount when he was playing for the Rams. So this isn't something where you're slotting an unproven guy into that spot. It's just changes. And they're actually getting bigger at those two spots by moving McGovern over. When you think about the construction of this run game, just how many downhill run concepts they're trying to trot out at you, it really does feel like this could work, even if we've never seen it in practice before.
And this is how the run game should be designed and how the offensive line should be designed, where you should just be a lot bigger. If you're going to be so spread in the passing game the way that they've been and the way that they're probably going to continue to be with Josh Allen, you might as well, if you're going to spread everybody out formationally, let's just pound people between the middle of the field. So I like it structurally. It's just, again, how good can these guys play compared to what they had last year?
Mine is what this new look passing group looks like. Like, what does the group of pass catchers look like? How do the roles shake out? When I was there, they were trying to sell this idea. And again, this is something we talk about in training camp where it's like, there's no positions.
Oh, come
Everyone's lining
on.
up everywhere. There's no X, there's no Z. We're teaching it all conceptually. And I'm sure that's true, but that's just become one of like the buzzy things that people say during training
Matt
camp.
LaFleur has like nuked the discourse on that, where he's like gotten so mad about the idea of a number one in roles that he's like, it's ruined.
Well, the funny part about this is Keon Coleman played like 53 snaps in the preseason. He played two snaps in the slot. So yes, like there are going to be sort of defined roles, but even coming out today, Brandon Bean was saying, we're seeing Dalton Kincaid is more of like this move piece where he's going to play a little receiver, which I completely understand. So I'm just wondering who's out there on the field at the same time. How much 11 personnel are you using? When you're in 11 personnel, how defined are the roles? Khalil Shakir is probably a mostly slot player. How are you going to use Curtis Samuel? Because he's been a guy who's been in the slot a lot over the last few years, even if he can do other things. Is Keon Coleman mostly a boundary type of guy that's playing outside of the numbers? Are you going to be in 12 personnel a lot? Because Kincaid is arguably at this point might be your most dynamic receiver. If you do that, who comes off the field? How much does Mac Hollins play? Because he's a very good blocker. And so if you're going to be in 12 and you want to run the ball, are we going to see more Mac Hollins than people might expect? So just the rotation and the roles and the usage with all of these guys as they cycle through it, I'm assuming they don't have strong, sturdy answers about that yet, just because we haven't seen much of it. So how quickly do we get to a place where these are our best 11. This is how we want to live because this is our best solution?
You could even go further than that. We didn't even start to mention Quentin Morris, who is obviously their best blocking tight end. They now have two, in my opinion, two running backs who are worth putting on the field, and James
Yeah.
Cook and Ray Davis. And James Cook is obviously more of a pass catcher. Ray Davis looks like a bowling ball. He can catch the football and he can actually run routes out of the backfield. So, like, there's a world where they're one of those teams that just end up in the middle of the pack for every personnel grouping. And you're like, I don't really know what they major in. They're kind of just a little bit of everywhere.
It was interesting. They only played 15.5% 12 personnel after Knox came back from injury last year, which was not very high considering you had Knox and Kincaid. And Kincaid actually played a decent amount in line even after Knox got back. So it's just going to be sorting through that sort of stuff. They were in 60% 11 personnel after Knox came back from injury last year, which ranked 23rd in the league. So I think that's right, is they're just going to be kind of middle of the pack in a lot of these different areas. I'm also curious what Kincaid's role looks like specifically, because before Thanksgiving last year, he was averaging 4.5 air yards per target. 4.5 before Thanksgiving. It was
That's not
gross.
what he should be doing.
It was disgusting. And then after Thanksgiving, it was 8.5. So you saw a pretty significant shift in the back half of the year when Joe Brady got there. Think about that touchdown he scored against Pittsburgh in the playoffs. So I just want to see it because, like you, I do tend to think they have Josh Allen. Joe Brady's shown enough of capability to do this. Like they will figure it out by the end of the season, but I still don't have a good beat on what that looks like with the roles and deployment necessarily.
Yeah, I think we're just guessing at this point.
The other part, though, like you mentioned, it is nice that they found kind of a metronome for the offense with the running game. This team finished third in rushing success rate last year, third on under center runs, first on shotgun runs. No team in the NFL had more first downs on the ground last year than the Buffalo Bills. And now you add Ray Davis to the mix, who looks pretty damn good, and you already have James Cook. Like this team's identity shift and their ability to kind of lean into that physicality, I do think it alleviates some of the pressure in figuring out how to be a top 8 passing game from day one because of some of the stuff that they can now lean on.
Well, and this is why getting the quarterback who does all the super insane high level stuff, like just the random flashes of superhero play, is important because you can start to just build the team this way and get some of the easier we can stay on schedule stuff. And then obviously the quarterback developed in that sense. Now you have the best of both worlds, and now you're just a powerhouse.
I said this on a couple different shows this summer. They had fewer negative plays last year that went for 0 or negative yardage than any team in the NFL. And
Do you think if you asked a random person that about a Josh Allen offense that anybody would believe it? Anybody.
we're gonna get to the Josh Allen discourse here in a minute because it has gotten very silly to me, and I just think that we've lost the plot so bad when it comes to who he is and what sort of offense this is because he is a part of it. Let's go to the other end here. What is keeping you up at night as you think about this year's Buffalo Bills?
So this is another team to me where the I'm setting the bar kind of high because they have a quarterback that's so good. So I'm kind of looking at everything through that lens. The defense outside of the front four in the cornerback room, like we mentioned earlier, the linebacker spot, you're asking a lot of young guys and guys who are bench players to come up and step up with Milano now out of the lineup. And then the safety room is just a grab bag of veterans, and we don't know what we're going to get from Cole Bishop. So I'm worried about them, not in the sense that this will be a bad defense, right? I think Sean McDermott has proven time and time again that he's going to get these guys to at least average and they're going to be a functional unit, but can they get to that top 7, top 8 where this feels like a really strong playoff team? That's where I start to get concerned.
Two things about this. One, you're just kind of penciling in the front four, huh? You feel good about the front four? Like, why do you feel so confident about that group? I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just curious because you're really saying it with conviction.
So Ed Oliver, I think, is really good, man. You know, I
I,
put him pretty firmly.
Even if we can see that, though,
Well, Daquan Jones, when he was healthy last year, was a really, really good player, like really fantastic player. And then the edge group, there isn't an ace. I'm totally willing to admit that, but I think they have like enough stable of guys. And if Rousseau takes any degree of step, I think that's going to be huge for them. That when you pair that with what they have from the interior, with a guy like Ed Oliver, who is going to get consistent pressure, and then Daquan Jones being a really good two-way player, I don't know if it's like an elite front, but I'm comfortable that they're going to get good play out of those guys.
I don't disagree with that. I just think that there are people who would probably have more questions about it, like the AJ Epinesa Von Miller combination on the other side. Like I actually thought that Epinesa had some really good flashes last year, and them getting him back for a decent price. He's only 25 years old. Like that combination with him and Rousseau, I do think is probably better than it looks on paper to people who haven't really watched a lot of this team. But I just you said it more confidently and quickly than I think most people would when talking about the Bills. So I was just curious. The other side of this. You think the floor is average. Like the floor of the defense to you is average.
Probably not the floor. Like I think if a lot of things go wrong, it's probably closer to like 20th. But I have such a hard time imagining that a Sean McDermott defense will be bad, like actively losing them games for stretches on end.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I'm just so worried, and we'll get to this in a second. What's keeping me up at night? It is on the defense. I'm worried enough that even seeing like a 16 next to their name, that seems more like a median outcome than a low end outcome. I do think that there are probably situations here because of some of the questions at safety, because of some of the questions at linebacker, where there are some stretches this season where they're struggling. Maybe they're not losing games for this team, but it's not a defined positive the way it has been for most of the McDermott tenure. Like last year, it took a catastrophic amount of injuries for them to be playing at a below average level. I don't think it requires that this year for them not to be playing very well.
I think that's probably fair. I think I just have enough faith that they'll at least be a neutral factor in this team's ability to win games, and then when you have Josh Allen, you're gonna end up in the positive on the net. So
For the most part this summer, that's how I was talking and thinking about it. I was just like, "Oh, they'll be fine. You know, they're the Bills. They'll be fine. They'll be fine on offense because of Josh Allen. They'll be fine on defense because of McDermott." But the spine of the defense is keeping me up at night right now. The safety is like the weakest point on this roster. You go from Taylor Rapp being your number 3 safety heading into last year to now him being your best, most experienced safety by far. Like comfortably the most experienced guy in that position. And last year, they were doing more to disguise things on the back end than they had really ever have been since McDermott got there. I don't think any team in the NFL lined up in single high and played two high coverages more often last year than the Bills. And when you watch them play, you kind of felt how dynamic that was in the back end. There was a head coach I was talking to during when I was visiting training camps, and he told me that their quarterback went up to Jordan Poyer after the game and was telling him how good of a job they were doing with some of the disguise stuff. And he was like, don't do that. Do not tell him that they're tricking you by doing that stuff. But so that's how bad they were. That's how good they were. And that's how much of a problem they were in that area specifically. So my question is, if you lose that because you're not as confident in your safety's ability to hide some of that stuff, to play out of position and then get back to a spot where you feel good, what is this defense if you remove that quality from it? I don't know what the answer to that is.
I think it's definitely a fair question worth asking. I think I probably just again have a little bit more. I'm willing to give Sean McDermott a little bit more of the benefit of the doubt because he's gotten good play out of just completely random players before. Do you know how long we thought Levi Wallace was a good outside starting corner because of Sean McDermott? It was
It's hard
quite
to
a
argue with
while.
that. Yeah,
So
it's
I
hard
don't
to
know if he
argue with
can.
that.
I don't know if he can recreate the same magic with this safety room, but we've seen him do it before.
The Milano injury, though, is devastating, and it's for the reason that you said. I mean, even if you remove the safeties, having him there as kind of a stabilizing force and a calming presence in the middle of the defense, somebody who can handle the communication, now you remove him from that, and you're relying on Terrell Bernard and Dorian Williams. And Bernard had some flashes last year, but he is not the kind of stabilizing force that a guy like Milano is for that position group and that unit overall. So that's an area where when you start chipping away at the safeties and the linebackers, my heart rate starts to go up a little bit in a way that I don't really like.
Yeah, it's the coach on the field aspect that you're losing with him that almost hurts more than what he actually gives you in terms of talent.
For each of these teams, we're talking about what you're most excited about as we head into the season. What is that for you and the Bills?
I adore Keon Coleman, dude. He is going to be such a good player. I had people seemed like they freaked out a lot about what Keon Coleman was post injury at Florida State because if we remember early in the season, every week was a highlight, bro. Like he was just doing the craziest stuff. He was hurdling people, crazy one-handed catches, all this stuff. And then he got banged up a little bit and he couldn't finish out the season. But if you even go back a year before that, when he was at Michigan State, we think that Jaden Reed is a pretty good player for the Packers now. Keon Coleman was outplaying him at Michigan State as more of a true outside receiver. Like this is a guy who can really line up as your X and he can kind of bully people and he can win the ball in the air. He just to me is it's not even just that I like the player that he is. It's just I so badly wanted a bully that could kind of help get the most out of Josh Allen's willingness to make some of those throws and plays. And I think Coleman is just the perfect player, man.
Gabe Davis is a big body, but he's not that sort of guy and has never
Right.
really been that sort of guy. And, Stephon Diggs is a better contested catch player than his frame should allow him to be, but also isn't that type of guy. I think even going further back, like John Brown, Cole Beasley era Bills, where you had these guys who were like 5'9", making up the entire receiver room in Buffalo. And then we had the Calvin Benjamin experiment that was on the wrong end of the other side, but this is sort of a unique new skill set being dropped into a Josh Allen offense.
Yeah, and I even saw Josh Allen. I think he did an interview with Chris Long, and he was talking just about like Coleman's. Josh was basically saying you don't see a lot of guys with Coleman's size who have this type of body control. And I was like, yeah, Josh is so bought in on what this type of player is. He wanted this guy so bad, and now he has it.
You're telling me I can just throw it up to this guy? Like that's all
Exactly.
I have to do? It's a nice place to be as a quarterback. What I'm most excited about is watching Josh Allen play football. And I didn't know that this was a controversial opinion. But some of the stuff that's come out over the last like 3-4 months as we've done all of our offseason content, like the idea that players in the league think that he's the most overrated quarterback in the league, or there were people executives surveyed earlier this summer where it was like, yeah, I just think he's a little bit overrated. I just don't understand that. Like I just do not comprehend how we can be at that place with Josh Allen where he does more than any quarterback in the league, not named Patrick Mahomes, at getting you out of shitty situations. Like the only team that has converted more third and longs over the last 2 years than the Chiefs are the Bills because of what he can do as a runner, as a thrower. He's exceptionally gifted in every facet that you want him to be. And he's really, really good down in and down out. Like, I know that he turns the ball over more than you'd want a quarterback to turn the ball over in a vacuum. But I've said this 1,000 times. If you combine EPA lost on sacks and turnovers over the course of last season, he was like one of the most valuable quarterbacks in the league because of how few sacks he takes. So the negative play considerations with him, I think, are way overblown. The down to down consistency is way undersold. And that's before we even get to the spectacular things he does. You said he's probably the second best quarterback in the league. I think definitively, in my opinion, he is the second most valuable player in the league. And he does it in a thrilling way. So I just don't really understand why we have these mixed opinions about what Josh Allen is at this point.
It's legitimately just quarterback wins in the playoffs. Like that's it. There's nothing else that Josh Allen needs to prove. Because like you said, he came into the league with all the flash and all the incredible stuff, but he's grown so much as a player. You know, at first it was okay, he learned to be a little bit more accurate, and then he learned to start to check the ball down. Now he's kind of opened up himself to play different modes of offenses given the game or given the game plan. Like he's just grown into such a complete player on top of having all the flashes. And then, like you said, he doesn't really take sacks anymore. He took a lot early on in his career. Like that was just he kind of had the I'm going to hold on to the ball and do some crazy stuff all the time, but he doesn't do that so much anymore. And I think part of the other issue with the discourse too is when a quarterback throws an interception, it is an obviously bad game changing thing. But when a quarterback takes a sack, we're just like, bad play, but we can move on. But when you take a lot of them, it can become a problem. And then when you take not a lot of them, it can be such this like hidden value that a team has. And Josh Allen has absolutely gotten to that point. So
And then the hidden value compounded by all of what he does as a scrambler. Like there's so many different layers to how he is helping your team over a given game and over a given season, combined with the highlight shit that happens all of the time. It's just so hard for me to imagine a world where we're like hemming and hawing about how good of a quarterback Josh Allen is. That's just how I see it right now.
if he just didn't have to run into the greatest quarterback of a generation every single postseason, then we probably would think more consistently and more higher of Josh Allen. But
Most important supporting characters for you on this year's Buffalo Bills team are.
we kind of already talked about both of the things that I have, but David Edwards on the offensive line, he's been a guy who played solid ball for Los Angeles when he was starting for them a few years ago, but he was never like a superstar player. But if they can at least get him back to the point where he's playing slightly above replacement level and then really fits what they want to be in terms of being able to move people in the run game, I think that could go a really long way for this team. And then just whatever the hell is going on at safety, just any of those guys being functional players would be nice.
Yeah, we already talked about the safeties. I'll throw Dalton Kincaid in there. And part of this is driven by the fact that I now have Dalton Kincaid shares in fantasy. So I'm invested in his success and I want to see him do well. And that's always going to inform the way that I see these teams every so often. I'm also going to go with the edge guys. You alluded to this a little bit earlier. Rousseau has shown some real flashes the last couple of years. In 2022, he had the high ankle, which kind of torpedoed the back half of his season. Last year, he had a foot thing that caused him to miss a week, and there were some moments where he didn't look 100% right. I thought that AJ Epinesa had like a career year last year on relatively limited snaps because Leonard Floyd was the starter. He outsnapped him by like 200 snaps. Rousseau's 24, Epinesa's 25. If both of those guys take even another step forward, even if it's a small step this year, Rousseau was like a top 18 edge guy in terms of disruption per snap last year, according to PFF. What if that gets like closer to the top 10 and Epinesa takes the rate stuff he did last year as more of a part-time player and extends that to a full-time role? You combine that with that Oliver and Daquan Jones, like you mentioned, can this room suddenly become a real strength for this team? And if you feel good about that and you feel good about the corners, does it start to alleviate some of the concerns that you might have about the linebackers and the safeties? So that's kind of my question is, which of these position groups on defense can lift everyone else around them and get this back closer to a Bills-like defense that we've seen over the last few years?
That's a good point because if the two young edge guys take a step, then the front actually feels like a weapon as opposed to
Yes,
a kind of above average thing that's giving you good play, but
a
not.
neutral.
Yeah, exactly. But now if those two guys take a step, it's a weapon for you, especially if you just want a four-man rush.
What counts as a successful season for these Buffalo Bills?
I know there's a lot of change and it's very turbulent in Buffalo, and they've got a lot going on and a lot of holes in this roster. When Josh Allen's your quarterback, you should be in the AFC title game. And that is not to say that anything short of that is a disappointment necessarily, but when that guy's your quarterback, you should be shooting for that every single time.
Even as somebody who loves Josh Allen, I still think that's pretty lofty for this year specifically. Here's what I'll ask you. Would you have said that about the Chiefs last year?
Yes, their quarterback is Patrick Mahomes.
I probably wouldn't have, and maybe I'm underselling Patrick Mahomes. When you're in a moment of transition like this, I think that it's okay to have slightly less lofty expectations. So for me, it's I think if they make the playoffs, as they've had to shed some salary, as they've gotten younger in some of these spots, that to me feels like a win. If you're a wild card team, even if you win 10, 11 games and you prove no matter what else is really going on around us, we are going to be relevant. I think that's a really good place to be if you're the Bills. And I also think you need some of the young, cost controlled guys to look like dudes. Because that's one of the issues with this team is that even if they've done a good job at being proactive and filling certain roles with free agency and getting creative and aggressive, they haven't had that many home runs in the draft. They've had some guys that have outplayed their draft slot by a lot. The Benfords of the world, Teron Johnson. Can you have a couple guys that feel like stars by the end of this season? You spent a first round pick on Kincaid. He be somebody that feels like a difference maker in your offense? Can Coleman really show some flashes? Because this is a team heading into next year. They don't have a ton of financial wiggle room next season. Like Allen's base salary is $14 million. Even if they restructure that again, they're still going to be up against it cap wise for the most part and not be able to do anything splashy. So I think the draft becomes really, really important over the next year or so, just because you're not going to have that many avenues to add expensive outside talent, probably until 2026.
Yeah, they desperately need a star because, like you said, they've drafted okay, and it hasn't completely sunk their roster. But other than probably really since like Ed Oliver, they haven't had a guy who is very obviously a star player for you.
And that was their last top 10 pick, right? They were picking in the
Yeah,
top 10 and had
it's
Oliver turned
easier
into
to
a
do it
really good
there.
player. It's much easier to do it. And that's part of the issue is that they pick it in the 20s every year, but you would just hope that one of these like third round picks turns into a superstar. Obviously, like guys like Milano, but all of those guys who have done it for them are on second and even third contracts at this point. So it is when you get there, when you're paying the quarterback this much, you've got to keep offsetting it. And I feel like they haven't necessarily done that to the level that you would hope.